Great. So welcome, Anil. Great to have you. I know that you've not been taking as many engagements recently because you've been working very hard on your book.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And yeah, straight to plug the book. Why not? Yeah, I've been working,
why not?
on the book. It's coming out in September, so it's actually on the home straight now, which is exciting, actually. So yeah, sneak preview of some of that stuff this evening.
Great. Okay, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
All right, so let's. So this is. I was just explaining well before everybody else came in. I was. An artist just sent me this sort of summary of my whole career in this kind of cartoon form a couple of months ago, and it was brilliant. I love it. It's actually a very good summary of all the things I happen to be interested in, and we'll take a little tour of some of those topics this evening. I hope to speak for about 40 minutes, as Amir said, and then have some good time for Q&A as well. A few things that I want to discuss briefly. So my main interest is in, very broadly, consciousness and its basis in the brain and in the body. And so I want to start just by explaining a little bit about my approach to studying consciousness scientifically from the perspective mainly of cognitive neuroscience. And then a little bit on three different dimensions of consciousness, with particular emphasis in this case of the relevance to psychedelics. And I have to say, I think I would say up front, my lab is not a psychedelic research lab. We don't administer psychedelics, which is not a core topic, but I'm fascinated for many reasons by them, and we've been involved in a number of collaborations at the intersection of sort of psychedelics and consciousness research. So I'll talk about conscious level, how conscious you are, conscious content, what you're conscious of, and then conscious self, the experience of being somebody. And as Amir said, this book is coming out in September. So if any of this is interesting, there'll be more of it in the book. The general approach I take to studying consciousness is something I call a little bit with tongue-in-cheek, the real problem of consciousness. And this is a tribute to the Australian philosopher. This is David Chalmers on a good hair day. And David Chalmers is very well known for distinguishing between what he called the hard problem of consciousness and the easy problem of consciousness. So David Chalmers said quite a long time ago now, he's restating an idea that probably Descartes stated most clearly before that. And he says the following: "It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does." So this is really a problem of what is the material basis of consciousness? How could we ever understand why and how anything that's made out of physical stuff should give rise to any kind of experience? That's just a big mystery. So Chalmers contrasts that with what he calls the easy problems. The easy problems are the problems that neuroscientists in general tackle. These are the problems of how brains work as mechanisms, how they do stuff, how they enable the body to generate actions, how perception works. And these easy problems are basically the functions and behaviors that brains enable, the functions performed by nervous systems. These can be very complicated, but there's no big conceptual mystery that easy problems are amenable to a scientific approach. The contrast is with the hard problem, which is, again, this problem of why and how any of this has anything to do with consciousness. The real problem takes a middle ground, and it's called, many people do this in practice and call it different things. But the specific way I think about it is the question of how can mechanisms and processes in the brain and in the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness. And these properties can be functional. So there are things that we can do in virtue of being conscious. When I'm conscious of something, I can talk about it. If I'm conscious of this glass of water, I can pick it up and drink from it, or just look at it and admire it. And there's also critically phenomenological properties. It's a horrible word, I think, but it really points to the experiential nature of consciousness. There's something about a visual experience that gives it the character, the feeling, the qualities that it has that's different from, let's say, an olfactory experience or an emotional experience, let's say. And so the real problem just doesn't try to say why consciousness is part of the universe. It accepts that consciousness exists and is intimately tied to the brain and the body, and asks, how can things happening in the brain and the body help us understand these properties of consciousness, not just the behaviors that we do and how brains implement functions, but properties of consciousness. A useful historical parallel for this, and it's only a loose parallel, is sort of how biologists approach the mystery of life. It wasn't that long ago that many scientists, biologists of the day, chemists, thought that life was something that escaped mechanistic understanding, that in order to explain the difference between the living and the non-living, you needed to appeal to some special source, some élan vital, a spark of life. And of course, biologists don't think this anymore. Life has become naturalized. We don't understand everything about life, but we no longer in science think that life requires some magic extra special source. And part of the strategy that allowed this development of a rigorous science of life was realizing that life is not one big mystery. It's not one big scary mystery. It's a bunch of other questions, like a divide and conquer strategy. You can think of life in terms of reproduction, metabolism, homeostasis, lots of different aspects of life. And if you explain, predict, and control these separately, then you build up an understanding of life in general, and the mystery of life tends to recede a bit. So this is the strategy for consciousness too. Study different aspects of it, and then this apparent big mystery of why consciousness is part of the universe may fade away too. No guarantee that it will completely disappear, but it's a sort of, well, let's do this hard work and then see where we are. So the three dimensions of consciousness, I already mentioned it at the outset, are conscious level, how conscious you are, conscious content, what you're conscious of, and conscious self, this specific experience of being an individual. Now, these aren't completely independent dimensions of consciousness. They overlap and they interrelate, but that's fine. They're heuristically, pragmatically useful ways of going after consciousness from slightly different perspectives and directions. So I'm going to start with conscious level. And conscious level, the first thing to say about this is it's not the same thing as wakefulness. They, in fact, although they often correlate, they can come apart in at least 2 or 3 ways. So conscious level really is this idea that there's a scale, a general scale of how conscious a person can be. When you're in a coma, you have no consciousness at all, and general anesthesia, hopefully the same thing. Deep sleep, light sleep, and all the way to conscious wakefulness. You're becoming more conscious. You're also becoming more physiologically awake in these cases too, which is why all these things lie along the diagonal of this graph. But importantly, you can go off the diagonal too. So when you're dreaming, in REM sleep, but in other stages of sleep as well, you're asleep, you're physiologically asleep, but you're having rich and vivid conscious experiences. And on the other side of the diagonal, there are conditions like the vegetative state, absence epilepsy, somnambulism, sleepwalking, where you are physiologically awake, but you are not having any conscious experience at all. So the question here is, what's happening in the brain and the body that specifically accounts for conscious level and not wakefulness? So there's a few things that we can rule out. I'm just going to skip over a large history of research here. There's a few things we can rule out from the beginning. The first, which are actually just very interesting facts about the brain's relationship to consciousness. The first is it's nothing to do with just the sheer number of neurons involved. There are about 80 billion neurons in the human brain, 86 billion roughly. 3/4 of them are in the cerebellum, which is this little bit of the brain hanging off the back. I don't know if the pointer works here, but it's around here, which is always amazing to me that the vast majority, the significant majority of neurons are in the cerebellum. And the cerebellum does not seem to have much to do with consciousness. You can be born without a cerebellum and you will have some problems, but lack of consciousness will not be one of them. There aren't that many cases of extensive damage to the whole cerebellum in adults, but on those cases where you do see big cerebellar damage, you also see problems, but not an impairment of consciousness. There doesn't seem to be any particular region in which consciousness resides in the brain. There are certainly regions that if you damage them, you will lose consciousness. These are found in the brain stem, which is at the between the base of the brain and the spinal cord. But perhaps these, although there are many different opinions about this, but my opinion is that areas there are probably better thought of as enabling factors, more like on-off switches rather than the source of consciousness. But that's, there are people who would say otherwise. And it's not just the amount of neural activity that happens in the brain that determines how conscious you are. The metabolic and neural activity in the brain remains high during states of unconsciousness. So this is all maybe reasonably obvious, and the direction this points is what features of brain activity then that are more complex than just how many neurons are firing can we use to try and track conscious level specifically. And the approach that we've been taking at Sussex is to look at something called signal diversity. Now, signal diversity is a measure, roughly speaking, of the randomness, which is a bit too roughly speaking, the randomness or the dynamical repertoire of the brain activity. How many different states can the brain enter as a complex system? It can enter, if the brain is just in like one state all the time, neurons just going boom, 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 it's not very diverse. If it's firing quite randomly, it's firing with a lot of different patterns, then it would have a high diversity. So based on quite a lot of previous work, we at Sussex were interested in, can we measure signal diversity in the brain and relate that to conscious level? And one way of measuring signal diversity is actually very simple. It's an algorithm that is used in any image processing setup in a camera. When you send a JPEG file, you have an image and you're compressing it into its smallest possible representation by taking out all the redundancy in the image, all the sort of pixels that the same color you collapse into one and stuff like that. That's very roughly what this algorithm does, and it is a measure of the complexity. Something that can be strongly compressed has low diversity. Something that can hardly be compressed at all has high diversity. So if we take this approach and apply it in this case to EEG data, in this first experiment from a few years ago now, this was EEG data from people who'd been anesthetized using propofol. And this was work with Michael Shartner, our PhD student, and my colleague Adam Barrett. And here we found pretty clearly that signal diversity goes down as you lose consciousness. So in this case, the brain is becoming more predictable, more compressible, so therefore less random, more predictable in its dynamics when you lose consciousness. This is across a number of different people. The next thing we did was we looked at sleep and dreaming, and this gives us a way to separate consciousness from wakefulness. This was a collaboration with a group in Italy where they had a bunch of patients who had electrodes implanted deep into their brain prior to surgery for really, really severe epilepsy. And so we could record from these regions during different sleep stages. And what again we found was that the level of complexity was much lower especially in early stages of non-REM sleep. That's the column on the far right. And we clustered our recordings into 4 different areas: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which is off to the back and the sides, the temporal lobes, which are off to the above the ears, and the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. And the complexity is generally, again, lower when you are in early non-REM sleep, which is a state of sleep where you're not likely to be dreaming at all. So you're most likely to be fully unconscious. So this is just kind of replicates the previous result, that the brain becomes more predictable, less random when you lose consciousness. But what was specifically interesting here was that when in REM sleep, when people are more likely to dream, the pattern looks very much like wakeful rest. So here, there's no difference in terms of the signal, the diversity, the randomness of brain activity when you are dreaming compared to when you are awake. So this seems to be now a measure that is tracking consciousness rather than physiological wakefulness. One other thing we found, which we still, despite this being years ago, haven't delved too far into, is that the frontal lobes seem to be more diverse than the other lobes, whatever state of sleep you happen to be in. It's still something we don't understand. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to tell you about this is that we then applied the same measure to activity recorded in the psychedelic state. This was in a collaboration with Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial and his colleagues there. And they had MEG data. So this is, again, brain imaging data. They're all recorded by slightly different methods, but it doesn't really matter because we're not comparing numbers between these different experiments. This was recorded from MEG, which is a very sensitive way of recording electromagnetic activity and localizing it to areas within the brain, very generally. And what we found here was really quite striking, which was that for two different classic psychedelics, psilocybin and LSD, and also for psychoactive doses of ketamine in the middle, we found that signal diversity reliably went up in the psychedelic state compared to the non-psychedelic state. So your brain is getting even more diverse, even less compressible in the psychedelic state compared to wakeful rest. And this was quite striking to us because we tried a bunch of other analyses to try and see if there are any situations where your brain dynamics went, the diversity went up compared to wakeful rest. We never found any example until we had a look at the psychedelic state. And in a sense, it sort of maps onto some aspects of what the psychedelic state is like. Your experience does seem to be, informally, very roughly speaking, a little bit less constrained by your immediate environment. It's a little bit more freely associative. It's a little bit more random, which is a very loose parallel, but a parallel nonetheless, that perhaps the sort of unconstrained nature of the psychedelic experience is related to a similarly less constrained nature of the underlying brain dynamics. So there's various sort of more mathematical versions of that statement that people like Robin Carhart-Harris have made, things like the rebus hypothesis and so on. But anyway, this is just the empirical data shows that you indeed see this big difference in a measure of conscious level in the psychedelic state. With Chris Timmerman, you found the same thing with DMT as well, and a very sort of short, fast-acting psychedelic. You see that complexity and signal diversity goes up in the active period of DMT, which is just this bit in the middle here where other things happen in the brain too. And when we published it, it had this kind of interesting reaction. So the Daily Mail, for example, along with other media, had sort of said that we'd found evidence for a higher state of consciousness, because this sort of level, this measure that goes down when you lose consciousness has gone up in the psychedelic state. And that's of course not what we meant at all. There's a specific interpretation of this, which is that your brain is becoming more diverse in the psychedelic state compared to the baseline of wakeful rest. And being a Daily Mail, they also had to have this big sidebar about the dangers of LSD and all that stuff as well. Otherwise, their readers would get very annoyed. But yeah, in Wired, which is less worried about psychedelics, they also said brain scans reveal how psychedelic drugs create a higher state of consciousness, which again is absolutely not what we were showing. We're just trying to really understand what is happening in the neural dynamics in that state. So more recently, we've been drilling down a bit further into what's happening in the psychedelic brain, using now a different class of analyses that look at how information flows between different brain regions in the psychedelic state. And this is a bit of a busy graph, and I only want to give you the headline picture from this. So this is just showing you that overall spectral power in the psychedelic state goes down. This is again looking at LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, and there's a fourth panel here, which is for a substance called tiagabine, which we use just as a control, an active control. It's actually an anti-epileptic drug. It's not a psychedelic, but it's still, it doesn't have a psychoactive effect, but it's a useful kind of just comparison. And so certainly psychedelics do stuff. They generally lower the amount of activity, especially in LSD, in interesting ways. But for us, what we wanted to look at specifically was this idea of how do psychedelics change how different parts of the brain speak to each other. And here we wanted to use a method that we've been developing in the lab for many, many years called Granger causality. And I just wanted to take 3 minutes to explain what this is, because it's very generally applicable. When we think about connectivity in the brain, you can think about it in at least 3 different ways. The first way is structural connectivity. This is the wiring diagram of the brain, how it's wired up as a physical system, the network of physical connections in a system. Then there's functional or dynamical connectivity, which is not just the wiring diagram now, but with patterns of activation and how they go together. So if 2 parts of the brain have the same changing activity over time, we would say they're correlated. We would say they are functionally connected. Now, doesn't mean there's a physical connection between them, just means that they're doing the same things. So that's functional connectivity. Equally, you would say that 2 parts of the brain that are synchronized are functionally connected. But then, interestingly, there's also effective connectivity, which is more of a causal claim now that says, okay, brain region A is causing activity in brain region B. And that's another sort of notion of connectivity. So there are at least these 3 different notions of connectivity. And in fact, within the middle one, within functional connectivity, there are 2 types of this. There's synchrony, where it's not directed, like if A is synchronized with B, B is synchronized with A. But there's also directed connectivity, where you can say now they're connected, but there's information flow from one to the other. And that's what we were specifically interested in. And to measure that, we use this technique called Granger causality, which is not really, people argue whether it's really causality, but it's measuring this thing called information flow. And this is the most detailed slide I'm gonna use today. So I'll try and explain it very briefly, but it's the main point of this is that if you have 2 brain regions with activity going on, then you say that one causes the other if it happens before the other. The cause occurs before the effect, and the cause helps you predict the effect. So you can say that there's information flow between region A and region B if activity in A happens before B, and region A helps you predict what's happening in region B. So that's all we mean by this method of Granger causality. And it's not that much used in neuroscience, but it's, I think, really important because it can tell you a lot more than just correlation. And if we look at this measure in the psychedelic state, we see something that was really striking and kind of unexpected. This is work with Lionel Barnett at Sussex. What we found, so here we're looking at the 3 well, the 2.5 psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, and tiagabine. So tiagabine, sorry, is the control. That's the non-psychedelic control. Red means more information flow or more connectivity from a particular brain region to the rest of the brain, and blue means less. So for instance, at LSD, what we're seeing is that brain regions tend to become more correlated with each other in LSD, but there is much less information flow from one brain region to the other in LSD. In psilocybin, correlation between brain regions is more or less unaffected, but less information flow. Ketamine, again, not much difference in correlation, but much less information flow. And in the control substance, tiagabine, everything goes up. So psychedelics tend to involve a general reduction in the information flow between brain regions. And again, this seems to be consistent with the fact that psychedelic experiences are less constrained and more diverse than non-psychedelic experiences. That's kind of what I wanted to say about conscious level. And of course, conscious level, when we start talking about psychedelics, it bleeds into conscious content. It's we're starting now, because you can equally think of a psychedelic experience as a manipulation of how conscious you are, but also what you're conscious of. Now I wanted to talk a bit more specifically about this second dimension of conscious content, what you're conscious of, how we understand that. And the first thing to mention here is that what we're conscious of is, of course, not a direct readout of what happens to be out there in our world, in our environment. It's a construction, it's an active interpretation of the sensory data that comes into our senses. There's many beautiful ways to illustrate this. This is always one of my favorite. This is called the lilac chaser illusion. And I'm hoping it works on your screens wherever you're watching this from. But if you just have a look at the black cross and hold your gaze and don't blink, then you should see all the magenta patches disappear and be replaced by a single green patch rotating around. And then if you move your eyes and blink, the green patch disappears and magenta patches turn up again. Of course, there is no green disk at all. There's only magenta patches that disappear one after the other. And so this is a combination of actually 3 different effects in visual perception. But the main point is simply that the brain is making its best interpretation that there's a green patch there where there is no green patch there. So the general idea to understand what's going on, not only in these unusual situations of visual illusions, but all the time in visual perception, is the idea that your brain is a kind of prediction machine, and that perceptual content is the content of your brain's best prediction or best guess about the causes of sensory input. And if you think about what it's like to be a brain, you're stuck inside a bony skull. You've got no direct access to what's out there in the world at all. All you get are these sensory signals, which are noisy and ambiguous and only indirectly related to things in the world. And so to come up with a kind of definite perceptual content, we all have the experience of a scene which kind of unambiguously contains images and objects and people and things, colors and shapes, have definite properties. So to convert this ambiguous sensory environment into this perceived world with its definite properties, we can think of perception as this process of inference where this ambiguous data is combined with what the brain is expecting to be out there. And then it's the brain's best guess modulated by the sensory input. That is what we see. Now, there's many examples of this process of sort of perceptual informed guesswork. I'll give you just one. These are called two-tone figures or Mooney figures. If you haven't seen this image before, it should hopefully just look like a random mess of black and white splotches with no particular structure or organization. But if I fill the image in, you can see that it's actually a meaningful scene. There's a horse and a woman with a hat on, and there's at least 3 objects in this scene organized in a particular way. Now, if I drain the color again from it, you should still be able to see echoes of the woman and the horse in those black and white patches. What the point here is that the sensory data hasn't changed. All that's changed is your brain's best guess about the cause of that sensory data, and that changes your conscious experience. So this is all kind of just illustrative of this idea that the brain is bringing to bear predictions or expectations that shape what we perceive. Now, in neuroscience, this idea of the brain as a prediction machine is typically thought of in the context of what people call predictive processing. And this is a theory about how the brain actually reaches these best guesses, how it achieves this process of taking ambiguous sensory data and converting it into a definite perception. And the idea basically is that perceptual content is conveyed not by reading out sensory signals, but it's conveyed by the collective top-down predictions that are anticipating the ongoing sensory flow all the time. And that bottom-up signals, sensory signals that come into the brain through the eyes, the ears, and all our senses, they're not read out. They convey prediction errors that simply report the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at every stage of processing. So whereas we normally think of perception as this readout from the outside in, this perspective says it's the other way around, that what we perceive is coming from the inside out or the top down, and sensory signals merely or mainly calibrate our ongoing, ever-changing perceptual best guesses by minimizing prediction errors. So if the brain is continually updating its predictions to try and get rid of these red arrows, these prediction error signals, that's what allows the brain to reach a best guess about the causes of its sensory signals. More formally, it means that the brain is approximating something called Bayesian inference. So it's making its optimal guess about the causes of the sensory data that it receives. This is again a little bit more of a detail, doesn't really matter that much, but the basic idea is that prediction errors, sensory signals flow, the red arrows flow from the outside in or the bottom up, and predictions flow in the top down or the inside out. And it's the combined content of the predictions that is what we perceive. Now, there's a bunch of evidence that's consistent with this view. I'll just give you a couple of simple examples. This was a study with Yaya Pinto from a few years ago. One of the predictions you might make with this view is that we consciously see what we expect to see more accurately, more quickly than what we don't expect to see, because our prediction errors would be minimized more quickly if the sensory data are compatible with our brain's expectations. And this is indeed, in this experiment, what we find. So what we did here was we had people and we showed them in one eye an image. In this case, it's an image of a face which gradually appears. And in the other eye, there are all these changing colored squares which gradually get dimmer and dimmer. And so what happens is the image breaks through into your conscious perception after some time. And what we found is that it breaks through faster and more accurately when it's what you expect to see compared to what you don't expect to see. So this is some evidence that we see what we expect rather than what we don't expect more quickly and more accurately. But this is a boring sort of lab experiment. And perhaps more interesting is, how does this apply out there in the real world? How deeply does it shape our everyday experiences? And we're all aware of this process to some extent. Whenever we see things like faces and clouds, that can be understood as the brain imposing its expectations into some ambiguous sensory data. There's no actual face in the cloud, but we see a face in the cloud because the brain comes preloaded with strong expectations to see faces everywhere it can. And so to try and understand a bit more about how expectations might shape perceptual experiences in general, we've been developing an approach we're calling computational phenomenology, which is basically building computational models of different kinds of perceptual experience. And the first thing we did here, and this has been around for a little while now, you might have seen this already, is that we took one of these off-the-shelf neural networks. This is called AlexNet. It's a neural network consists of a number of layers, and it's very good at classifying objects in images. You can show an image and it will tell you what objects are in it. And it operates in a feed forward or bottom up way. So you show it the image and activity goes up through the network and it comes up with one sort of activation at the top level, which tells you what's in that image. But the clever people at Google realize that if you run it backwards, then you can basically project an expectation into the image itself. So now instead of updating the classification about what's in the image, you update the image until the network settles into a stable state. Google, they call this the deep dream algorithm. And what we did at Sussex was we took that algorithm and we applied it to panoramic video taken on Sussex campus. And this is work with Kesuke Suzuki in the lab. And so this was a panoramic video that we had on a non-pandemic Tuesday at Sussex. And we processed every frame of the movie through this adapted deep dream algorithm and stitched them together. And people would watch the panoramic video through a headset so that it responded to their head movements. And you can see that it comes up with a very strange experience here. There's all sorts of strange things going on. There are dogs everywhere, but it's not like just dogs photoshopped into images. There are dogs appearing organically out of the image. And it's been, a number of people have suggested this is not unlike some kinds of psychedelic experience. It's obviously not exactly the same. It was not designed to be a model of the psychedelic experience, but it has some similarities. For us, it was very suggestive because it says, okay, now we can use this kind of method to actually model not just the functions of the brain or model perceptual processes in general, but model different kinds of perceptual experience, different kinds of, in this case, hallucination. And so we have this, the general slogan that comes out of all this is that hallucination is this kind of uncontrolled perception where the brain's expectations are not reined in by sensory data, whereas perception is a kind of controlled hallucination where the brain's best guesses are reined in by sensory data. So what we've been doing since then and what we're currently doing now is expanding on that work to try and understand a bit more about the diversity of different kinds of hallucinations. And they vary in many different ways. They can be different kinds of complexity. People can hallucinate complex objects or scenes or just simple patterns. They can vary in how realistic they are. Call this veridicality, whether they have the properties that are similar to normal perceptual content or not. And they can vary in their spontaneity, whether people have hallucinations that come from a visual seed that is sort of derived from something out there in the world, or whether they happen spontaneously. Finally, they can also vary in their experienced reality, whether people experience a hallucination as really being part of the world or not. And for instance, so in some conditions, and these aren't just now psychedelic experiences, we're now talking about all kinds of visual hallucinations, including especially those that arise after or along with certain neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia, where people often have visual hallucinations. So what we do is we now use a different kind of neural network. This is with Kesuke and David Schwartzman, Alec Chatz. We use a different kind of neural network, which has two components. One is a bit like that first network that I just showed you, which is just very good at classifying images. We can run it forward or backwards. And the other is called a generator network, which is very good at recreating an input that it's given. And so by combining these networks and sort of coupling them in different ways, we get a much more flexible platform for simulating different kinds of perceptual experience. And then the idea is we can use those. They basically give us a computational model of what's going on in the brain that would underlie these different kinds of hallucinatory experience. And so we can model, for instance, complex hallucinations that might arise in Parkinson's disease. This is kind of a complicated image. What I'm showing you here is on the left, is a bunch of starting images, and then as we go towards the right, it's what the network changes them into after a certain amount of time. So for instance, a bird changes into a flower type thing here. So these are very complex images. They're meaningful, and they're kind of realistic too. But we can also simulate hallucinations that might appear from visual loss. There's a condition called Charles-Bonnet syndrome, where people lose central eyesight and tend to have visual hallucinations that are realistic, but are not experienced as being part of the world. We can begin to understand how those arise, and also psychedelic hallucinations that might be both complex or simple, more composed of patterns. And if this is just showing you a few movies of how this works in practice, if we simulate, there's a bunch of starting objects and what they end up looking like after running through this process. So it's sort of different from the neurological complex hallucinations. This is Charles-Bonnet syndrome, where people hallucinate following visual loss. In this case, they have simple geometric hallucinations, and then different kinds of psychedelic hallucinations. So this is a way of exploring the space of possible visual hallucinations. And what we're now doing is we're actually going back to people who have different kinds of visual hallucinations in Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, and Bonnet syndrome. And we're interviewing them to see if we can map their lived experience of visual hallucination onto our model. In fact, we give them outputs from the model and ask them to try to figure out which best matches their experience, so we can close the loop and match people's visual experiences to the model, so that we can better tune the model to recreate the experiences of these different conditions. Still ongoing work, but it's a way of drilling further down into the computational architecture underlying visual hallucination. The last thing I want to tell you about is another method that we're at the beginning of, which is creating hallucinatory experience using strobe lighting. This is something that's been around for decades, but has been relatively overlooked, I think, in neuroscience and psychology. And it turns out that if you put someone in front of a strobe light and have them close their eyes and make sure the strobe light is bright enough, then people will have all sorts of interesting visual hallucinations. It basically works for everybody we've ever tried it on, but there's still quite a lot of variability in the kind of visual experience that people have. Why does it work? Well, this is something that we're still investigating, but the basic idea is that the stroboscope strongly entrains brain activity especially in the visual cortex, and it's that entrainment that's somehow involved in generating this unusual conscious experiences that people have. And again, the strobe has to be, it works, you have to have your eyes closed. And when your eyes are closed, your brain is not expecting visual stimulation, but it's getting it anyway because the strobe is sufficiently powerful. And I think that's also key to why it works. So this is, if you like, it's a really useful method because it's a non-pharmacological way of inducing altered experience in human subjects. We don't have to get all the licenses to give psilocybin and so on. Also, we're not changing the chemical milieu of the brain, we're just changing the activity patterns, and we change people's experience. So although this is at the beginning, I want to tell you just a little bit where we are with it. This is with David Schwartzman again. And we've done some pilot studies. We've run, in this case, 19 people who reported at least simple visual hallucinations, but the majority also reported fairly complex hallucinations as well that might involve things like specific scenes, hallucinations of faces of friends, family, and strangers, where they could make out individual features and so on. Another participant had the experience of standing in a parking lot with two people walking towards them. So these are pretty detailed experiences that people report in these strobe situations. And so we're now, one of the projects we're pursuing quite actively is to drill further down into this, both to find out what's going on in the brain, but also to characterize the nature of these experiences in a more rigorous way. So this is just a standard questionnaire, the altered states of consciousness questionnaire. And we see here that there's quite a considerable overlap between the strobe, what people report under strobe, and what they might report under psilocybin. Now, they're not the same, and these questionnaires oversimplify things. There are many differences too, but it just points to the idea that there are many ways to induce altered states of consciousness, and this is another interesting one. And again, very early stages, but we're also seeing that just as signal diversity, the randomness of brain activity went up in the psychedelic state, it also seems to go up in the strobe light state as well. So there might be a common neural signature of altered perception in these states. Finally, we're also using some innovative methods where we can try and capture what people actually experience in these unusual conditions, rather than just having them fill in questionnaires or describe in free report what they experience. We're trying to develop some online tools where people can basically twist a variety of knobs and come up with and change how patterns like this are produced. In the visual psychology, there are these things called Kluver forms, which are supposed to be basic perceptual forms. And we can try and basically simulate different kinds of perceptual experience by combining these Kluver forms in different ways. And if we give people the ability to twist the pots and combine them in different ways, we can actually get them to see what best matches what their experience is at a particular time, to try and quantify their hallucinatory experience. So that's still going on as well. Just to talk about self a bit, because I wanted to touch on self. So the first thing to say about self is that it's not like this. There is this naive view, which I'm sure we don't, probably nobody has anymore anyway, but this is the view that the self is this little homunculus sitting inside your skull that is receiving all this information, that there's a world out there, we detect it, and it's the self is doing the detection of sensory data to form perceptions of that world. The self, in this view, is the thing that does the perceiving. The other way to think about this cycle, and I think the more correct way, is that the self itself is a perception. It's not that the self does the perceiving. There are processes of perception going on in the brain, and some of those lead to experiences of the world, and others lead to experiences of the self. But it's the same basic process that underlies them both. It's this process of perceptual predictions being constrained in various ways by sensory prediction errors. And when it comes to the self, there are actually a number of different ways in which we experience the self. There's not just a single experience of selfhood. There's experience of the object in the world that is our body, the experience of the bodily or embodied self. There's the experience of having a first-person perspective on the world, the perspectival self. There's experiences of free will and of agency, of volition. And then finally, there's the experience of being a continuous individual over time with a set of memories and plans for the future. And the experience of social self is the degree to which we experience ourselves refracted, if you like, through the minds of others, which a big part of what it is to be a human self, at least. And the idea is that all of these aspects of self are perceptions of particular kinds. And I just want to mention one of these aspects, which is the bodily self. This is the experience of the object in the world that is our body. And what we experience as being our body is a perceptual best guess, where sensory data are reined in. Sensory data serve to control predictions about what object in the world is our body. There's a very famous illustration of this called the rubber hand illusion, which you may well have seen before, where somebody's real hand, the guy in blue, his real hand is hidden from view behind that partition, and a fake hand is put in front of them. And then both hands are stroked simultaneously with a paintbrush while the person is focusing their attention on the fake hand. And the idea there is that because this person is seeing touch and feeling touch on a fake hand, that's enough evidence so that the brain makes its best guess that the fake hand is in fact part of the body. Now, that's been the story for many years, but actually recently in the lab, we think that may not be true, may not be actually what's going on. So we've just, in the last couple of years, done quite an interesting experiment, I think. This was led by Peter Lush. Did the world's largest rubber hand experiment, where we did the rubber hand illusion on about 400 people at Sussex. And what we're interested in was the degree to which they experience this illusion as a function of how hypnotically suggestible they are. Hypnosis is not just stage trickery. It's not just Darren Brown. It's a very reliable individual trait that measures the ability for people to generate experience according to suggestion. And the rubber hand illusion setup is a very strong implicit suggestion that you should have a particular kind of experience. You see this fake hand, people ask you whether you experience it or not, it's being stroked, and so on. And we actually found a very strong correlation between how hypnotizable you are and the degree to which you experience this illusion. So this is, I think, kind of interesting, because it could apply to very, very many experiments about perceptual experience, especially experiences of that are related to the body, because those seem to be particularly malleable, particularly changeable, and they seem to depend strongly on individual suggestibility, which is, you can think of that as a sort of top-down factor that means that the more suggestible you are, the more strongly your top-down predictions will constrain sensory data and will shape what you experience. So this applies to the rubber hand illusion. It may also apply, and this we haven't tested, but this is just another context where simple manipulations can generate very unusual experiences. So this is called the body swap illusion. And what you do here is you take, this is us doing it in an informal setting, you take two virtual reality headsets, they have cameras attached, and you take two people, they each wear one of these setups, but you swap the camera feed. So now that each person sees themselves from the perspective of the other. And if you then have some intervention, such as they shake hands with each other, so they get some sort of multisensory stimulation, a lot of people report this strange experience of somehow now feeling that they have left their body and are seeing themselves from another body's perspective. This is often called a kind of autoscopic illusion. They're seeing themselves from a different perspective. Again, this is very likely influenced by how suggestible they are, but for people who are suggestible, the effect can be quite strong. And it's a fascinating thing to be part of. I've tried it out a couple of times in different situations, and I found it quite powerful. And I think it goes to show as well that that people can have interesting and highly suggestive experiences for quite simple reasons. And of course, an experiment like this relates to things like out-of-body experiences. People have long talked about out-of-body experiences, reported in cultures for thousands of years. And the existence of out-of-body experiences does not mean that the self or the soul or whatever is sort of separable from the physical body and can go floating around. What I think reports of out-of-body experiences underline is that the experience of where you are in space is another aspect of perception. And it's just another best guess that the brain reaches on the basis of ambiguous sensory data. And sometimes it reaches the conclusion that you're not in the body. That's fine. You have that experience. It doesn't mean that there's an immaterial soul that's left the body. Saying that there's not only experiences of having a body, this object in space, but I think at the root of selfhood is the experience of being a body, of simply being a kind of living organism. And this is not something I've got experiments to show you, but it's more of an informed speculation about where I think the roots of selfhood lie. When we think about experiences of being a body, this brings up the point that a whole raft of perceptual channels have to do with perceiving and controlling the body from within. These are called interoceptive perceptual channels. Interoception, the sense of the body from within, the sense of the physiological condition of the body, if you like. So we have neural pathways that sense the heartbeat, blood pressure, gastric pressure, all these things that continually informing the brain about how well the body is doing at staying alive. And if you think about it, that's the fundamental thing that brains are for. They're for keeping the body alive. So if brains are continually involved in sensing and regulating the internal state of the body and perceiving the internal state of the body. And just by extending the same story we've already told, this is done in exactly the same way as all the other aspects of perception I've talked about. There are predictions. In this case, there are predictions about the causes of sensory signals from inside the body, and there are prediction errors. So sensory signals from inside the body report prediction errors between what the brain is expecting and what it's getting. But there is one very important difference between perception of the body from within and, let's say, visual perception, looking around, which is that perception of the body from within, interoception, is all about control. When the brain is perceiving the body from within, it's perceiving the body in order to regulate it. It doesn't care where the internal organs are or what shape they are. It just cares whether they're working properly, whether they're keeping the body within the bounds that are compatible with ongoing survival. And this, to me, explains, or at least suggests, why our experience of the body from within is the way it is and is not like a visual experience or an auditory experience. When the brain is making predictions about visual signals, we experience things like objects and spaces between objects. We experience things in a spatial frame because the purpose of vision is to figure out roughly what's out there in the world and where it is with respect to us. But when we make interoceptive predictions, when our brain is making interoceptive predictions, the brain doesn't care about where things are, it cares about how things are going. So we tend to experience things along the dimension of valence. Things feel good or bad, or various refinements of that. We experience emotions. Emotions are what we will experience when the brain is making and updating predictions about the internal state of the body, rather than visual experiences. Now, this returns us back to where I started an hour ago now, I'm sorry, about the origin of this debate on consciousness with René Descartes and later David Chalmers. Descartes, as well as splitting consciousness away from the rest of the physical universe, also thought that life had very little to do with consciousness. He said about other animals, without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. So for Descartes, the living body was not that relevant to at least the important parts of conscious experience, the rational mind. But on this story that I've been telling, it's rather the opposite, that our conscious selfhood, in fact, all of our conscious experiences emerge because of and not in spite of our beast machine nature. So Descartes called other animals beast machines just to emphasize the fact that he thought they were lacking in feeling, lacking in consciousness. But it seems it might be the other way around, that is, in fact, our nature as living creatures that gives all our conscious experiences the texture that they have, because they're all fundamentally rooted in these predictive mechanisms that originated in evolution and in development in order to keep the body alive. So rather than I think, therefore I am, I prefer to say I predict myself, therefore I am. And that's what, to me, the self is. It's an ongoing set of neural predictions that fundamentally are in the business of keeping the body alive. I just want to thank the people in the lab who've done a lot of the work. So the people on the left are the people in the lab, and on the right, Tim, Jacob, Marcello, and Robin are collaborators outside of Sussex. And last thing I wanted to say is that I'm involved in this very exciting new project with Festival UK 2022. It's a big art science project. It's going to be happening through next year with a bunch of collaborators from the arts and the sciences that will pick up on some of the aspects that I've been talking about today. So hope to tell you more about that another time, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. So I've heard you speak several times and heard several podcasts and stuff, and every time I hear something new, and it's always totally fascinating. So thanks. And as you know, the aspect of your work that I wanted to bring to the foreground this evening was something that you've said regarding, maybe I'll just read a quote. I'm quoting you, so hopefully it sounds relatively familiar. To have a baked-in understanding of the constructed, compositional, and impermanent nature of self is the sort of understanding where I think you see a convergence between many different traditions, by which I think you meant mystical traditions, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's the kind of understanding that makes us feel continuous with nature rather than separate from it, which again is an experience people have on psychedelics, and many mystics talk about it, and meditators, and indeed in some traditions, it's seen as the goal, the pinnacle. Enlightenment is when you see this very clearly on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just make one more comment, and maybe you can just riff off this a little bit if you're okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
A famous mystic from the last century, Ramana Maharshi, talked very much about seeing through the self as another object on the screen of perception, and at the core of that is the root of all suffering being the I am the body idea, that being an idea. And if one can see through that, the body doesn't disappear into a puff of smoke, but it's seen to be another object on the screen of perception, no different from all the other objects on the screen of perception that we call the world. So yeah, I've just thrown a bunch of stuff at you, and if you're happy to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to dive into there. I think so I'm not sure where that quote came from actually. Where did I write that?
I think it was in the esteemed academic article, the journal, the Russell Brand podcast. But
the Journal of Russell Brand podcast, right? Yeah,
yeah, maybe. So it's not a published quote, but so
yeah, that sounds likely. I mean, there's a long history of interaction, as I'm sure you know, between neuroscience and especially consciousness research and some sort of more the Eastern traditions of especially Buddhism and different varieties of Buddhism too. And I think this is very powerful. I've been influenced a lot over my career by people like Evan Thompson and Francisco Varela, and organizations like the Mind and Life Institute, which have had substantial involvement from the Dalai Lama as well, that try to explore the productive middle ground between these spiritual. I prefer to sort of bracket off the spiritual aspects rather than calling them religious traditions or mystical traditions here, because I think want to get away from the belief structure embedded in these and more to the sort of embedded psychological insights and phenomenological insights that arise in these traditions. And from that perspective, and also Thomas Metzinger, I think one of the more also contemporary philosophers who's taught me a lot about this, there is an enormous and positive overlap here, especially when it comes to things like how to think about the self and how to think about perception, this idea of impermanence and of sort of non-reification of the self. So trying to avoid the temptation, this naive realism temptation where we experience the self as an immutable essence, which is fairly strongly invoked in a lot of Western cultural traditions. So I think that there's huge resonance there, and it can sometimes go, I think, a little bit too far. Sometimes it's what for this dialogue to be useful. I think what's been really impressive about the Mind and Life organization, the interaction with some of the more the Buddhist scholars, is that there's been an openness to engage with the science as well, rather than sort of saying that it's just the science is just rediscovering truths that had already been written down in some scripture some time ago. And I think opening up that dialogue is really useful, because what a lot of these traditions can bring to one of the things they can bring to the table is a much more refined understanding of the explanatory targets for a science of consciousness. Because we're really, I think, really bad at this, and it gets back to one of the things is you either have people trying to tackle this big mystery of like, oh, consciousness is part of the universe. How does that happen? Is it synchronous neurons, or is it sort of quantum nonsense, or is it something else? Or you have this sort of very experimentally rigorous but very restricted approaches. This is how the neuroscience of consciousness got restarted about 30 years ago, was just by focusing on something like visual perception and just saying, okay, what's the difference between when I consciously perceive a red patch versus not consciously perceive it? And that's really powerful methodology, but it's extremely limited about, the range and nature of conscious experiences that we humans experience. And understanding what experiences of selfhood actually consist in is an essential part to then trying to understand how what their biological underpinnings might be. I think another sort of related question there is, do you end up in the same place? Like, does sort of studying the neuroscience of self lead you to the same? Is it a different way of arriving experientially at the same place? I don't think it is. I don't think that, I would make no claim that having been studying or researching, coming to scientific insights about the nature of selfhood is in any way equivalent to having sort of spent 10,000 hours meditating in the Himalaya and reaching some state of semi-enlightenment. I don't think the academic understanding does get you to the same place that direct experience does, in exactly the same way that I don't think studying, understanding what's happening in the brain in the psychedelic state is any equivalent to actually the psychedelic experience. But it is surprising to me. It's really insightful how these things do match up. And I've not spent 10,000 hours meditating, but more and more I sort of walk around the world with this constant thing going on in my head that's reminding me that the self is not a thing and that everything I'm perceiving is a construction. And I think the more that becomes part of a sort of mental routine and more baked into my own personal cognitive architecture, I found it very useful. I don't know what the alternative would be now, because this is how I've ended up existing, but I think it probably does alleviate some suffering and add some richness, because it allows a certain amount of detachment from emotions and experience that would otherwise be hard to achieve.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated because obviously this perceiving the world and the self as a construction can, in one tradition or to one person, be incredibly liberating, but to another person be frightening. And equally, when some of the construction of self breaks down, in one person it's considered some kind of mental disorder, or indeed creates problems in their functioning in the world. And someone else who's maybe has meditated for 10,000 hours says, they'll claim, or they'll say they're experiencing a very different experience of the self in the world, but they're full of bliss, and they seem to be very kind and very functional, and they can still brush their teeth. And do you have a sense of when you gave those different categories of what the self is it that they're successfully modifying or seeing through one of them versus another, or it's kind of a roll of the dice? Or is there any research on this yet? What's your sense of, like, for why one person it's liberating, for another person it's incredibly troubling?
I think it's I mean, this is just a speculation, really. One of the reasons that psychiatric disorders seem to be particularly distressing and seem to sort of have a momentum where they become more and more distressing over time is tied to this idea that if you think that the self is sort of one thing and really exists as an essence, then if certain aspects of how you experience yourself go awry, it's very easy to reach the conclusion that the essence of you, is severely under threat. And that can then amplify the distress that's caused in a psychiatric illness. Whereas if you can begin to understand that, no, it's not that the whole of me is going irredeemably wrong. It's that one aspect of the way I'm experiencing myself has been altered and is changing. Then it can be much easier to deal with. At least, it's going to vary a lot individual by individual. But it's the difference between being kind of classified or classifying oneself as just like, I'm crazy, I'm mad, I'm rather than, okay, my experience of agency is a little bit off mark, or my experience of body ownership is a little bit off mark. And if you can rationalize these experiences in some ways, then and realize that the rest of you is still there, then that can potentially be helpful. And there's one example. There's a whole body of work now about which is called computational psychiatry, which is indeed trying to apply this approach, maybe from a more doctor-centered perspective than a patient-centered perspective at the moment. For instance, to try to say, okay, what's a little bit like we were doing with that visual hallucination models, but like, can we understand what's happening in schizophrenia as a sort of aberration in perceptual inference? Does that explain the symptoms that people have in schizophrenia, and especially the different kinds of symptoms that different people report? Schizophrenia is a complex disorder. It has many different manifestations. But you can also think of it from a patient-centered perspective as well, that if you give people the insight that their perception is constructed, it can help them deal with some of their unusual or aberrant experiences better as well. And there's been a number of examples where I've seen that, or I've heard that can happen. I think something fundamentally different is going on in your experienced meditator, where that's really all about appreciating that perception is constructed and having a frame to put that in. So rather than thinking you're losing grip on something that you assume to be real, you're realizing that things that you assume to be real have a constructed nature, and therefore I think it becomes easier to deal with changes.
Yeah, so it could be the cultural context, including the tradition someone is in when they experience some of these changes in perception or insights into perception can change their experience of it. And I'll maybe just ask you two more questions before we open up to the audience, and say if you need a little 5-minute break as well. But you presented some quite new data on psychedelics and their effects and the amount of diversity they create. And I know there's a lot of talk, at least there used to be in meditation circles, about, if you go into certain meditation states and there's a lot of synchronous alpha, as an example, like far more coherence and much more synchronicity, which would indicate to me that it maybe correlates with less diversity. Do you know if some of what you talked about with psychedelics has been compared to long-term meditators yet, or if we see more diversity or less diversity in people that are, again, claiming to be in these kind of states of bliss and now and less default mode network activation, this kind of thing? Or
actually, that's a good question. I can't bring it to mind. We haven't looked at meditation. I think there is a bit of work out there that looks at there's a lot of work looking at the neuroscience of meditation and neuroimaging studies of meditation. It's a little, to me, it's a little bit of a murky area. Part of the problem is that you can study long-term meditators, but then you don't have a comparison condition. You can only do between subjects comparisons, because these people have been meditating for 30 years to get to that stage. So that's problematic. Whereas with, for instance, the psychedelic, you can take a single person, you can have them pre, during, and post, in the space of a day, and it's the same brain. You can't do that with long-term meditation. Or you can do something that's like more short-term. You can have a long-term meditator that can put themselves in different meditative states, and that's been kind of interesting. So Mathieu Ricard has done a lot of stuff like that. The quite well-known French neuroscientist come monk. But he's already his not. So for a long-term meditator, when they're not in a meditative state, it's still the brain of a long-term meditator. So it's not the same as a. It's still a little hard to interpret. Or you do something where you look at people who are just gone through some intensive but relatively short-term meditation course, but then again, they're not having the same experiences that we would be really interested in, which is the experiences that long-term meditators. So it's a bit murky, and the empirical data, I think, is it's interesting, but I'd have to check, but I think you might see some suggestions of similar changes in signal diversity with meditation, but I don't think it's quite so clear.
Yeah, and I suppose one interesting phenomenon to study is some long-term meditators who claim to now remain conscious all the way through sleep, all the way through the night, and they're conscious of a void or conscious of nothing, and who knows if that's really what's going on, or there's some kind of illusion that's creating that. But I guess it would be interesting to compare what's going on in their mind with the diversity thing, your aspect you talked about, and wakefulness and stuff.
It's easy to be skeptical of a claim like that says someone is now conscious all the way through the night. And my immediate reaction is to be quite skeptical, because these things can be very easily confabulated.
Yeah.
But the more, for instance, we study sleep independently of meditation, the more complicated that becomes as well. And it turns out that if you there's a experimental paradigm called serial awakening, where you just, it's horrible, it's like a terrible thing to be a subject in. You get woken up at various points in the night, and then an experimenter just says, what were you experiencing? And you have to say, were you having an experience at that time? The idea is, if you do it that way, you minimize the possibility that people are misremembering experiences from some previous time. You say, what's in your mind now? And if you're in the middle of a dream in REM sleep, you'll often report a very rich scene. We've all had the experience of waking up and being deeply immersed in a dream that you forget instantly. But if you did have the discipline to report it straight away, and some people do keep dream diaries, very complex. But if you wake people up in non-REM sleep as well, quite often they will report some kind of conscious experience. It's usually quite simple, but there's stuff that consciousness seems to pervade sleep to a much greater extent. And certainly I was led to believe at the beginning of research, where I thought, okay, when you're REM sleep, you're dreaming and you're conscious, and when you're not in REM sleep, you're not. No, it's much more complicated than that. And so, yes, maybe the meditators are onto something. And this gets back to, I think, where we started, that the value of one of the values of this intersection is in a much more refined understanding of what we're trying to explain, what is happening in our conscious lives that we miss because we're not trained in paying attention in the way that people who've experienced with meditation are.
Yeah. And I'll just finish kind of, again, taking inspiration from a comment in the chat, but something I've been very interested in anyway, which does move us more into the area of philosophy. But obviously, in other talks, you emphasize more our experience of our reality as a controlled hallucination, and you've spoken about how there's a sense in which we've got very little grasp or idea of what's actually out there, what is being perceived as we can presume at least to be helping our survival, but what it is that's surviving and what's out there in kind of an objective reality sense is still anyone's guess. And this obviously brings us around to this idea that we've spoken about many times of the brain being where consciousness is located. But of course, the brain is another object on the screen of perception. It doesn't necessarily have those colors. It doesn't necessarily have those weight in any objective sense. The brain is another object appearing in mind, but where is mind? And consciousness being the kind of only thing that we can, at least individually, verify as being absolutely certain. I can be absolutely certain of that I'm having a conscious experience, but where it's happening, or the brain being an icon on the screen of perception, as it were, in the same way I can open up on my computer a little screen that shows how my CPU is activating, but I wouldn't say that those pictures that represent. Anyway, where I'm going to this. So I don't know if you want to update us on your view on that perspective, or. if you feel it feeds into your research in any way.
I mean, there's a couple of, I think in terms of the research we're doing in that area, it's we're trying to find ways actually to experimentally investigate this aspect of perception which involves the conviction of reality. And it's subtle, but it's often overlooked because it's almost always there, and we don't question it. You open your eyes and you just experience the world as being real, and as the objects as really having the colors that they seem to have. And this is one reason why this whole idea of understanding that perception is a construction is quite hard to fully assimilate, because perception by design doesn't seem that way. It would be very, I think, evolutionarily inconvenient for our perceptual systems to kind of give us the impression that perception is a construction. The mechanism kind of has to be hidden in order for it to work. We're not going to run away from the lion if we don't experience the lion as really existing. And lions do really exist. I mean, that's the you get eaten, but for instance, the color that we experience the lion to have, that color is not a mind-independent property of the lion. So there are things that in the universe that are mind-independent. Back in philosophy, these are called primary qualities. So solidity is a mind-independent quality. If you stand in front of a bus, it's going to hurt whether or not you're perceiving it. But then other things are mind-dependent. Look, secondary qualities like color and things like that, those do depend on a mind to have meaning. So the question is, how far down does that go? And even for things that have mind-independent existence, the way we experience them is still mind-dependent. So if I will experience something as having solidity, but that perception is not a direct access to that mind-independent nature. It's still mediated by my perceptual mechanisms. And there are cases where we don't experience things as being real. So if you look at if you look at the sun and close your eyes, you'll have this kind of after image in your vision. And that's one example of where your perceptual experience is not experienced as being a real part of the world. We experience it as a kind of glitch. So it's not always there. And there are kinds of there are some psychiatric conditions like derealization, where people begin to experience their environment as not really existing. And Charles Bonnet syndrome, one of the conditions I mentioned earlier, people have visual hallucinations, which they experience as not really existing, even though they have a perceptual vividness. So there's a rich space to explore here. And we're trying to use virtual reality at the moment to come up with situations where we can systematically manipulate this by, for instance, having an environment where people put on a headset and they look around them through a camera and they see the world through their camera. They see what's actually there through their camera. And then unbeknownst to them, we've taken another panoramic video of that same room under the same lighting conditions and whatever. And we can flip the input to the pre-recorded video. Now, if we do it right, they will not notice the change, and they'll continue to experience their environment as really existing, even though it's now a pre-record. And the question is now, how far can we alter the video while they still have this conviction of what they're experiencing as being real? So we can at least, that's one way of beginning to experimentally address this conviction of reality thing. So that's there was a whole other direction that this point could have gone in, which is, of course, the very valid point that whatever we call the brain, we only know it through the interface of perception too. So all these points apply to our experience of brain. Of course, in normal life, we don't have an experience of the brain. We experience with the brain. But I remember the few occasions I've seen a brain, and it's like, well, actually, it's a phenomenal thing to experience. But then it's also like, that's another object in the world. And then all the the representations we have, it's networks of neurons, it's this or that. None of those get at the essence of what a brain really is. It's as hidden from us behind this veil as everything else.
Yeah. I don't know if you bother looking at them, but there are some quite angry comments in response to your TED talk, which I'm assuming come from a kind of fear reaction. They're not personal to you. They're just like, what do you mean? So, it is a confronting thing to be told that everything you're perceiving is not actually real. Your perception that it's real is also simply a construction, which I'm sure everyone's experienced at least sometimes in a dream, where a dream can feel real and you wake up and then you reinterpret that experience as no longer being real, even though in the moment it felt incredibly real. So most people have at least access to an intuition that, well, this could be true of this moment now as well. I could wake up in 5 minutes and decide retrospectively that this was a dream and not real. And so it's kind of a long way of asking, it seems to take most humans a little bit of courage or bravery to really look at this on an ongoing basis. And I'm on a personal level, I'm curious, is there something, have you experienced some kind of ego death? Has there been some kind of experience where you've been willing to confront this more head on? And as you say, it's permeated your life now. So you're walking around and it's like, wow, everything I've experienced is a construction. It's a different way of living.
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's hard to really be sure. I mean, in one sense, one of the nice things about taking the scientific path, I mean, I've always been interested in consciousness. It just seemed like this big, this really, it's a sort of it's a naive, childish question in some ways, but it's also one of the oldest eternal questions, like, who am I? What's going on? And I've just been lucky enough to been able to keep wondering about it for my career. I didn't, though, have any sort of pre-existing notion that the sorts of things I'd be thinking about now would be the things I'd be thinking about. That's just sort of how the trajectory has gone, especially this idea of thinking about the basis of self in the brain predicting and regulating the body, and these really close ties between selfhood and consciousness and the body. That wasn't something I sort of set out to show scientifically at all. I mean, it's still not shown. It's still really speculation, but it's where that trajectory of ideas have led. Now, at the same time, there's been a couple of experiences in my life that have sort of, I think, interacted with that scientific journey and given it a relevance and an urgency in some way that it wouldn't otherwise have had. And the first one was a few episodes of pretty serious depression of about 10 years ago. And that's, for those people who've encountered, it's very difficult to compare one person's depression with another. All I know that for me, it was really not good at all. And it came back a couple of times, fortunately not for quite a while. And this was, at the time, I was already beginning to think a little bit along the lines I now do, but not dramatically. I was mainly doing other things. One of the issues in the state of depression is, is that it's very much worse if you reify the self, and you have this sort of vicious circle where if you really believe what you're experiencing is real and is true, it gets worse and worse. It sort of self-amplifies, self-reinforces. And one of the approaches to depression in cognitive therapy, but also mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in particular, is this idea that the way you feel, the thoughts you're thinking, the emotions you're experiencing will pass. They don't necessarily reflect an external reality or an internal reality. They're going to pass. And thinking about perception as construction, and especially at that time, I'd begun to think about emotion also as a kind of perception. Again, not a new idea, but I'd begun to think of it more computationally in terms of this this idea that only been applied previously to things like visual perception, I began to think, oh, maybe that's the same thing in emotion. That actually really, it wasn't like a panacea. It didn't sort of make everything fine and go away, but it certainly helped. And I think it's looking back on it, it was an important, I think it's an important spur to continue to think that way. And I think it's probably helped in the years since, in just having that slight detachment from experiences of emotion, experiences of self, has been quite useful. And in later years, I've also I've sampled a couple of different psychedelics as well, just to explore. I think it's important in consciousness research as well to have the first person experience of the things you're trying to explain. They're never captured by third person descriptions to an adequate degree. So the one thing I haven't done is 10,000 hours of meditation, because I'm just not self-disciplined enough to do that.
It's hard to fit that in your day as well. Yeah. And just to echo, I also used to experience a lot of depression, and I can get incredibly sad still. I've experienced a lot of sadness, but depression does seem to be distinct somehow and related to self in it. And I attribute that, touch wood, to these kind of practices or these kind of distinctions around perception. Okay, so the top voted question is, what's your take on split brain studies and their implications for conscious experience?
So split brains are a fascinating, kind of very prominent part of the consciousness research history and culture. So just for those who might not be completely familiar with it, split brain is an operation that's still done, but very rarely, for people that have intractable epilepsy, and you basically cut the brain in half. You don't go all the way through. It's not completely disconnected into two halves, but the cortex is severed into the left and right hemispheres. You cut through this structure called the corpus callosum. And back in the 60s and 70s, when people were doing quite a lot of these split brain experiments, extraordinary findings by people like Michael Gazzaniga, that there seemed to be signs of two simultaneously coexisting conscious agents within a single subject, because you could get, if you showed different images to the different visual fields, you get different responses, but only one would seem to be able to tell you, because for most people, language is lateralized in the left hemisphere. It's one of the only cognitive functions that's reliably lateralized to just one hemisphere. And the left hemisphere receives information from the right visual field, not the right eye, but the right visual field. So if people are looking ahead and you show information to the right-hand side of the fixation point, that goes to the left hemisphere. And then for a split brain patient, or split brain person, they can tell you what they've seen. But if you simultaneously show something else to the left visual field and it goes to the right hemisphere, they cannot verbally report it, but they may still behave in a way that shows some sensitivity to it. And again, this is now because the arms are also controlled in this crossover way. So just as right visual field goes to left hemisphere controls right hand. So you'd have these peculiar situations where the right hand and the left hand would be doing opposite things, or you'd ask, for instance, the classic experiments would be, you would show the right hemisphere an image and it would draw something, and then you'd ask the person why they drew what they drew, and the left hemisphere would basically confabulate an explanation, or the person might laugh or something like that because you'd shown the right hemisphere some funny scene. The left hemisphere with language hadn't seen it, but it would still make something up to try and explain the behavior of the body. So you had this folklore idea that you had two subjects within a single brain. And the next remarkable thing is that you have to have these peculiar situations to notice. A split brain operation is incredibly benign. You think these differences would be very, very clear in normal life, but they're not at all. This is why the operation was quite widely done, because it didn't seem to affect the person that much. That's always been a surprise to me. Now, there's a kind of new wave of split brain research. I've been a little bit involved in it, which is trying to revisit a lot of these early studies, because although the messages were quite dramatic that you seem to have these two different subjects, the actual experimental methods were, well, they were done in the 60s and 70s, and they weren't as rigorously controlled as they would have been had they been done now. So it now seems that actually the differences in the few split brain patients that are still around, it's a little bit more subtle. So it seems, for instance, that a split brain patient can localize visual information wherever it appears, but they can't integrate visual information across the middle of the visual field. But they can still detect visual information wherever it is. So the situation is becoming more complex. The really interesting question that I think has yet to be answered is whether there are two separate conscious agents in the different hemispheres. Can you have two simultaneous but different intentions to do things within the two hemispheres? That is still not really known. What's very clear from the split brain studies is that it challenges this idea of the unity of the self, that there is a single essential thing that it is to be you. It could be that you can have a disunified perception, but a unified sense of agency. It could come apart or not come apart in all sorts of different ways. But it's very challenging. The main issue with it now is that these operations are hardly ever done, because, well, for good reasons, that there's actually advances in other areas of medicine. So they don't. So a lot of severe epilepsy that couldn't be controlled before now can be controlled with medication. And if you don't have to go and cut the brain in half, then you typically don't do it.
Yeah, it's quite a weird little interlude in the history of science where there was a brief window of opportunity to study this phenomena. Unlikely that many people will volunteer for it in the future.
Well, I can't resist telling, because there's another sort of weird little corner of neurosurgery that I got fascinated by and started working a little bit on, and we actually want to pick it up again post-pandemic, which is called hemispherotomy. So the split brain thing, one of the quite spooky implications of it is, like, there could be this right hemisphere that is somehow or somewhat independently conscious, but has no access to language. It can't express itself. Is it this kind of weird island of consciousness that's trapped in the non-verbal right hemisphere? Now there's another intervention called hemispherotomy, which is basically the extreme version of that, where it's usually done in kids because their brains are very adaptable and the outcomes are a lot better. But you completely isolate a hemisphere. Now, a split brain is you just cut down the middle, but in a hemispherotomy, you disconnect all the connections into and out of the right hemisphere of the brain. So you completely isolate it from the remainder of the nervous system, but you still leave the blood supply intact. And so effectively what you have is a completely isolated but living piece of cortex in the right hemisphere of somebody's head. And that's a true sort of potential island, a cortical island. And then you get this very quite disturbing question about, could that be supporting any kind of conscious experience? Now, in philosophy, people have often talked about these thought experiments like a brain in a vat. And how do you know you're not just a brain sitting in in a, on some mad scientist's desk with being stimulated in a particular way so that you think you're in the real world. This isn't quite that thought experiment, but it captures this idea that maybe you have a brain that is not, in fact, that isn't connected to the world, that could still be having conscious experiences. So again, this is very rarely done, but I witnessed one of these surgeries in 2019, and it's a phenomenal operation. It was very successful, and the kid went from having uncontrolled seizures all the time to being back home in a week, and it's phenomenally successful. But we wonder, there's just beginning of efforts to think, well, what's going on in these isolated bits of living cortex that can no longer communicate with the rest of the brain? Super interesting question.
Yeah. Could consciousness be a field that pervades all things, and our mind the mechanism through which we experience the parts we focus on?
So this calls an idea, this is sort of reflecting this idea of the brain as a receiver type thing, and that consciousness is, some sort of pervasive field. I don't find much appealing about that idea. I think it's very hard to rule out, but to me it doesn't explain very much. When we think about different metaphysical positions about how consciousness fits into our picture of what the universe fundamentally is, there are a number of different options. And we can have idealism, that consciousness is all there is, and the problem is what's matter. We can have materialism, which is that consciousness is somehow a property of matter organized in a particular way. Dualism, that there's two different realms. And in deciding among these positions, I always ask myself, well, what difference in practice does it make? It doesn't seem to me to explain much more, to think of consciousness as some field that imbues everything. It's more sort of panpsychism, and the brain happens to be a receiver. I'm not really sure what the mechanism for that would be, how it would work, what it would explain. There is a temptation, there is this general sort of panpsychist temptation to think of consciousness as somehow existing everywhere and in all things. But again, I'm not really compelled by that position, because it sort of floats freely of the landmarks that we have to try and explain what our conscious experience is like. And one of those landmarks is, well, consciousness goes away under general anesthesia. That gives some sort of tangible perspective on what it is we're trying to explain. That it's what goes away under general anesthesia. And if we know that, then we've got some sort of landmarks to navigate by. If we think of consciousness as somehow in everything, to some extent everywhere, then it becomes very hard to know how to experimentally interrogate it.
Do you have any thoughts on the potential of psychedelics to treat disorders of consciousness, possibly via an increase in complexity? So I guess this relates to what you're saying earlier about the increased complexity during psychedelics.
Yes. So as I'm sure probably most of you know, one of the big exciting opportunities of psychedelics is for treatment of various psychiatric issues, and particularly depression being one of the main ones. In fact, there was the paper from Robin's group just came out this week in New England Journal of Medicine comparing psilocybin against an SSRI. This is not something we work on directly, but I'm also very excited by this potential. What's interesting to me here is what the mechanism might be, right? Why would psychedelics be expected to have an effect, and when should they have an effect? You can think, is it just because of the neurochemistry? Is it the neurochemical mechanism that they work on? Almost certainly not. And people have some people have raised the idea that if you could manufacture something that was somehow neurochemically equivalent, but didn't have the psychoactive effect, a sort of non-psychedelic homologue, wouldn't that be preferable? And to me, it seems very unlikely that it would actually work, because there seems powerful reasons to think that the reason psychedelics are effective is precisely because they affect conscious experience. And that's an essential, and this again is not, this is just my speculation, an essential part of the effective mechanism. And the reason for thinking that is that that's typically how things work in medicine. If you have a system that's going wrong in some way, and you're trying to find a way of treating it, you want to find something that affects the system in question in ways which are ideally also non-toxic and non-addictive and all the rest of it. And what's going wrong in psychiatric conditions primarily is your experience of things. Now, that's not some sort of optional side effect of a psychiatric condition. A psychiatric condition is a disturbance in the way you experience the world and the self. And so an intervention that's going to be successful is something that directly affects your experience of the world and the self. And then there's a more specific reason why you might think it would be powerful, which is, we mentioned earlier a little bit about depression, and the recognition that perception is a construction is a way of opening a bit of space to realize that, oh, the way I'm experiencing the world and the self is not the way it always is not the way it always has to be. It's something that is continually being generated and regenerated. And psychedelics can give you that experience that, oh, now my experience world is completely different, and my experience of self is completely different. Therefore, it's not always going to be the way it has been and the way it is. So it sort of pushes back against that sort of self-reinforcing tendency or reifying tendency of perception to underpin our assumptions about what is unchangeable, what is real, and what is permanent. So these are the reasons I think that the experiential component of psychedelics is likely to be intrinsic to their therapeutic value. But to demonstrate that is an empirical question. I know there's some experiments going on there's the group in Switzerland, I think, which has developed what they think is a non-psychoactive psychedelic. And they're looking at sort of mouse models of this and to see if it works. But I'd be surprised. And by the same token, it's less surprising that things like SSRIs are less. SSRIs don't change your experience directly. And that's why they've been widely prescribed, which to me is sort of getting things completely back to front. But I just see that I've been talking about the wrong thing. Somebody wanted me to talk about coma and vegetative state rather than depression and psychiatric conditions. So the answer to that is maybe yes. And I know there's a bunch of people working on that. I mean, I don't think there's any evidence yet, but given that loss of consciousness entails loss of diversity, it's not unreasonable to hypothesize that psychedelics might, in some cases, have a therapeutic effect on disorders of conscious level, though I think it's unlikely they're going to be dramatically effective. Restoration of vegetative state, recovery from vegetative state, or severe disorders of consciousness is incredibly rare and not likely to be, might be helpful, but I'd be not very optimistic about a massive difference.
Yeah, it would be quite miraculous, wouldn't it, if you could put someone on a drip of DMT and that would kind of draw them out.
Yeah, there's so many ethical issues with that as well, because you can't get consent from these patients, and the work, and given that to the extent they have any residual awareness, and if you suddenly put them on a psychedelic, that might not be quite what they want.
Yeah.
Difficult research to do.
So we'll move on to the next question, but I'll just put in the chat, relevant to that last comment, this study that shows that maybe some effects can be had with psychedelics even without the psychedelic experience. I haven't read that yet, but just someone posted it, so I thought I'd add that in. Great talk. You show evidence for how LSD, DMT, etc. increase signal diversity in EEG data. What about other common substances like alcohol?
I don't know. Short answer is the only thing I could say to that is that we tried for quite a while to look for other manipulations of this diversity level, which didn't involve being anesthetized or falling asleep, or being in a coma. And we had people watch interesting versus boring movies, be engaged in a task versus not. None of these things really made a difference. And I think it's partly because this signal diversity level is usefully blunt. It's not a very sophisticated picture of brain dynamics. And that can actually be useful in some ways, because it means that it's nicely insensitive to a lot of noise that would otherwise, you're doing something different all the time. Your brain dynamics are going to be different all the time. And if you want to, sometimes you need to zoom out a little bit to see the differences that matter. And the diversity measure might hit this quite useful sweet spot. I mean, I'm sure it's not the end of the be all and end all. There are many other potentially more interesting and more informative measures. But we hadn't found any other manipulation, any of these more simple manipulations that affected diversity. And then we looked at the psychedelic state, and it really did strongly. Didn't look at alcohol, didn't look at caffeine or these other depressives or stimulants. I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you'll find a difference, because there will be a difference. There will always be a difference there. But sometimes you want a difference to sort of leap out to be significant.
Can you talk about the loss of agency in DPDR from a predictive processing point of view? Why is this perceived as a negative experience versus enlightenment? And I imagine this person may be referring to, in non-dual circles, it's considered some kind of attainment to have seen through the illusions of agency, and people say, oh, they no longer experience personal agency or like any free will. There's just actions that are happening. The same way the sun is rising and then going down, and then like my mouth is moving and words tumbling out of my mouth. But and that's a very freeing experience of everything is just in perfect flow without anyone having to decide what to do. But then in the context of DPDR, it's a negative experience, quite frightening.
Yeah, so DPDR is this depersonalization, derealization syndrome we mentioned earlier. And I think actually you covered it earlier, Amir. It's all about the set and setting, in a sense that's how I would think about it. I don't know if it's been directly addressed. But for people with depersonalization, derealization, these experiences are not, they're not expected. They're not put in the context of an enlightened experience of how the world and the self is. It's something scary that's happening, because we are raised, we're brought up in a culture in which we're encouraged to experience our intentions as our own, and our actions as being caused by us, and for things to be real. And this is part of the reason these conditions are extremely hard to detect. People tend to rumble around mental health service providers for a very long time, because the symptoms are not positive. They're not like, I'm having a hallucination. What the hell is going on? They're negative. Something is lacking. Something is missing. And so they're much harder to figure out. And it often takes people a while to get a diagnosis of that. But I don't think it's not only that. I mean, that I don't want to be misunderstood as saying it's actually the same thing that's going on, but in one case it's DPDR, in another case it's sort of meditative enlightenment. I think they're operating at very different levels as well. And I think it's still a pretty open question about exactly what level are involved. So something like a meditative state might operate at somewhat higher, in scare quotes, higher levels of the cognitive architecture, where we develop a metacognitive or higher level awareness that our actions or our intentions are not associated with a sort of an immutable self. Whereas DPDR might play out at lower levels, which directly affect our perceptual experience.
So yeah, let's try to fit in a couple more questions. What is the relation between signal diversity and entropic brain hypothesis and the entropic brain hypothesis? Couldn't we say that higher diversity / entropy means higher conscious level?
That comes from Robin, Anna, and Carl Friston, and it's this. I think it's one of several attempts to think about the psychedelic state in terms of this framework of predictive processing or its variants. And as far as I understand the idea, it's also getting at this sense that there are relaxed. The brain has more relaxed assumptions about what's going on in the world and the self in the psychedelic state. So this rebus, I think it stands for relaxed. I can't remember what the acronym actually is now. But in some sense, it's indeed compatible. So you would think under the entropic brain hypothesis, the idea is that the brain has a higher potential for entropy, higher potential for diversity in the psychedelic state, which is indeed what we find. I think that the tricky thing is the interpretation of that in terms of this idea of the brain as a prediction machine, and in terms of whether that's a higher or lower level of consciousness. This is where I don't think there's terms of higher versus lower level really work anymore. I think they work to some extent when you go down into sleep and anesthesia, but then I don't think they work going up quite so much.
Maybe I'll just finish this one because I think it'll be fun and easy, hopefully, to answer. Can you recommend any books or films while we wait for Being You to come out? So Being You is the book that Anil has coming out in September, I think you said. And maybe there's films or other books that might give it more context that you would say, like, yeah, go watch this in the meantime.
Books and films. Well, I mean, I can only bring to it. So for those of you, I'm sure you've all seen it, but if you haven't seen Ex Machina, you have to see Ex Machina. It's absolutely brilliant. That would be the film. And the book, actually, there's a book that I recently finished, which I really enjoyed, thought it was extremely useful. In general, it's called The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb. And the reason that I would recommend that book is it charts this whole history of the metaphors that we've used to think about the brain. And this is a hugely important lesson for the present and future of neuroscience as well. We use metaphors for everything in science, right? We're always trying to understand things in terms of metaphors. The current, or now perhaps fading, metaphor for the brain is as a kind of computer. But it wasn't always that. There were other metaphors for the brain before as a sort of network, kind of telecommunications network, or the plumbing system, or something like that, or as a machine. A machine is a kind of metaphor as well. There's just the concept of machine, just to see how those metaphors evolved over time and the influence they had, and how people were able to think new things about the brain in virtue of having some sort of metaphorical scaffold was hugely illuminating, and I think ultimately quite optimistic that with new metaphors, new conceptual scaffolds, we'll be able to understand and think new thoughts about the brain in the future.
So just to say, every time I've heard you speak, you've brought all these issues right to the foreground of my mind, and it has really changed, at least for a few hours or a few days, how I experience reality, because somehow this top-down consciousness of everything is somehow constructed. Life takes on a slightly different tinge, and at least for me, it's quite pleasant. So I enjoy it, and it's also very intellectually stimulating. So thanks so much for coming to Psychedelic Society and speaking with us. And maybe if you're open to it, you can come back when your book's been published and support with those themes. Or yeah, let's see how things go.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for spending the evening with me. It's been a great pleasure. I hope to be back.
Great. Thanks, Anil.